It's Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, so you know what that means. It's time for another episode of #EventIcons, presented by Endless Events, the show where you get to ask the icons of the events industry anything. Use the question panel on the webinar to submit your questions, or you can hop on Twitter. Submit your questions with #EventIcons. We'll be answering your questions live during the entire show. Before we get started, the more people we have watching, the better conversation we can have. So please help share #EventIcons on Twitter and Facebook. Just tell your friends to watch at www.event-icons.com. Now, without any further delay, this is #EventIcons.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Event Icons. I'm Brant Kruger, and I'm being joined today by Jeff Frank. Today, we're going to be talking all about setting client expectations. Jeff is the event producer and experiential marketer building contextually relevant experiences at the intersection of physical and digital that inspire measurable action for global brands and events such as MTV, Dreamforce, Olympics, American Express, Levi's, Mercedes-Benz, and Microsoft. So, you know, a couple of companies we've heard of. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Man, great to be here. I love the podcast, big fan. So it's a new experience being on this side of the camera.
Well, we're glad you're here. This is one that's near and dear to my heart, and I want to talk a little bit about how this episode came to be. But before we do that, let's talk about how you got into the industry and how you got to be where you are today.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Having watched the podcast and just talked to other colleagues, and inevitably you ask, well, how did you get into the business? And I'm always kind of surprised and a little bit taken back by how many people fell into it by accident.
We hear that all the time on the show.
Yeah.
The number of people that answer this first question with by accident, it's amazing.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I've known since I was probably 10 years old that I wanted to be involved in some kind of behind the scenes production, putting things together. Didn't know how that would manifest itself. Didn't obviously understand what a career would be at 10 years old. But for me, really, the entry point was music. I was a diehard music fan since a little kid, as long as I can remember. And I knew I didn't have the talent to be a rock star. So I said, well, I better learn the business behind the scenes and figure out that side of the music business. So I really got into events as a college student. I was a stagehand at an arena on my campus. So starting at 18 years old, I was pushing road cases and setting up production for touring bands. And that just gave me the bug. Once I got behind the scenes and I saw how everything worked, and, you know, for me, it was amazing. Like, to me, as an 18-year-old kid, I had the greatest job in the world, even though I was getting paid, you know, peanuts. And from there, it evolved. I worked in terrestrial radio at the start. I was always pursuing other productions to get involved with, always networking, always trying to introduce myself to new people. Eventually, that led to bigger and bigger things. I started working on the sports operations side of things within the Olympics and FIFA World Cup. But music has always been the thread throughout my career. And then in '97, I joined MTV, which was my dream job. It paired the perfect two things I love the most: production, putting things together, and music. So I spent a couple years of my career there, and out on the West Coast now, where I'm an independent contractor like yourself, typically being hired as an event producer or experiential marketer.
And then the second part of that is always, what would you be doing if you hadn't gone down this road?
You know, so my current crush is home bartending.
Nice.
I've fallen in love with trying to experiment and create drinks at home, or following other recipes and making them at home. There is a job in this world that is a brand ambassador for liquor companies. So specifically for me, being a brand ambassador for Buffalo Trace Bourbon would be my dream job. There's a couple brand ambassadors I follow on Instagram, and they have the dream job. They travel around the world, interacting with bartenders, introducing their product, hosting different bartender competitions. and there's so much ingenuity and there's just so much creativity that's happening in that space right now. So yeah, in a different life, who knows?
Well, that I will say is a new one. I don't think we've heard that one before. So kudos to you on that one. So home bartender coming up with new drinks. I think at one point a couple years ago we came up with the Polar Vortex when we were having one of those, but I don't remember for the life of me what was in it. And that's probably a good thing.
I'm gonna guess something to warm you up, like Jägermeister or.
It warmed you up.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, like I said, I want to get down to how this episode kind of came to be, and talk about what we're going to be talking about today. From my end, and then I'll let you kind of tell your end. But Jeff, this is something that's always been kind of a hot button for me, going back to the days when I worked for a production company, which I did for just about 18 years. And it seemed like there were so many issues that would crop up where people would just kind of shrug their shoulders and go, what are you going to do? It's what the client wants. And, right. And then someone would wind up having to stay up overnight, in a locked room trying to get this done or that done, or 5 truckloads, someone would have to run back to the warehouse, at 1 o'clock in the morning and come back. When it was my experience that if you just went up to the client and said, hey, just so you know, even if you weren't planning on charging them anymore, just like, hey, just so you know, we can make that happen. But, Rob's going to have to run back to the warehouse after he's done tonight at about 1 a.m. So just, is this something that you would really want, just exploring it a little bit. And if they're like, yeah, we got to have it. Okay, great. We'll make it happen. But, more often than not, if they're like, oh, if somebody's going to have to do that, no, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. And that was just kind of my experience that, kind of managing the expectations and just being honest about stuff, to be honest, yeah. is what would bother me. And so as I recall, and maybe you can take over the story from here, I must have ranted about this at some point on one of the shows.
Yeah. So, it was a couple weeks back, and I was catching up on episodes, and you and Will were talking, and I can't remember how it came up, but basically the subject of client expectations came up, and you chimed in. You had a very visceral reaction that yes, we need to do an entire episode on that. And I was kind of reaching through the screen going, yes, entire episode on client expectations. For me, I think the RFP process is broken. I, having come from both sides of both agency and being on the brand side, I just think the way that the RFPs are submitted and the impact it has on resources, people don't appreciate when they're the client, and it's, the Friday before a holiday weekend and you're sending out an RFP for something that's due on Tuesday or Wednesday. That has an impact on people's lives. And I think many times clients just become so conditioned that an agency will we say, jump, and they say how high, and that's just been the protocol. So I think it's at least worth talking about, and maybe some of the tips and tricks or just guidelines that we both use to manage client expectations would be interesting to some folks.
Well, and I think, we're in the position to do some of that because we both have had the opportunity to be on both sides of that situation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, in your experience levels, you've been kind of on both sides of that equation. Is that correct?
Yeah, both brand and agency.
Yeah. So, as client and then as supplier, we definitely get to see both sides. But I'm curious, could you expand a little bit on, what you just said about feeling that the RFP process is broken? Maybe just expand a little bit more about what you think, why you say that.
So if you're company X and you've got a new initiative, a new product, let's say, and you want a experiential partner to help you create a campaign, you obviously want to get a variety of ideas and choose the best. You have that luxury, and that is typically how it works, and I fully understand and appreciate that. So typically, you put together an RFP that you send out to 5, 7. I've heard as many as 10 different agencies bidding for a piece of business. And if that's the case, obviously you have a 10% chance at best to win that piece of business, even if you're the most amazing agency out there. There's so many dynamics and factors behind the scenes that you just are not privy to as an agency that affect who wins the business. So you have 10 different agencies who are then having to put resources, internal resources, obviously non-billable hours, towards winning new business. And that has an impact. So it can either take away from existing business that is already being worked on, or of course, there are people who are dedicated to just managing RFPs as they come in the door and assigning resources. But I think from a business perspective, and this is a question I had to Will, I said, you as a business owner, if you get a new piece of business through the door, a potential piece of business, how do you evaluate that against your resources to say whether it's even worth our time to respond? Or if not, how do you then say no? And the way this subject also came up was I said to Will, one of my favorite questions to ask an agency when I'm talking to them about potentially jumping on board to help them is, hey, when was the last time you actually said no to a new piece of business and why? And almost every single time the agency is taken aback and they're like, I don't know. I've never been asked that question, which is shocking to me, but also telling that this process is broken. Not every piece of business is right for every agency. So for me, I'm curious to and hear your perspective too, is how do you then evaluate what's come in the door against the potential ROI of winning that piece of business with your resources, because that costs money.
And it's always difficult. I mean, when you're first starting out and you're either a small company or an independent contractor or something like that, and I can definitely say that I've felt this pressure to take everything that comes in the door, right? Because you're building your reputation, you're building your client base, you're building, that kind of thing. But when you actually look at, the reality of the situations and what little kind of studies and articles that have been done about this type of thing, what actually comes out is you're much better off being more limited, being more exclusive, taking the kind of clients that you want, rather than, overextending yourself or, underpricing yourself, undervaluing. I mean, when you talk to veteran consultants or, veteran, small business owners or something like that, almost every single one of them will say the same thing, which is that they wish they had charged more when they were younger.
Right.
When they were first starting out, that they wish that they had charged what they actually felt they were worth.
Right. Yeah. And part of that is just, lack of experience or lack of education in that area, and you develop and you learn that. But I know of a ton of examples where it's an arms race, right? And you're trying to figure out how can we be the most competitive bid without giving away the farm, but still putting our best foot forward, whether it's creativity or whatever the elements are, but without, and being able to make margins, right? Being able to make profits. So, I just think it's an ongoing process. And I think going back to something you had mentioned before, that I think there is this kind of general state of fear almost of an agency being afraid to go back to the client. And as you pointed out, saying, hey, just FYI, here's the impact it's going to have on us. I'm not saying we're not going to do it, just in the interest of transparency and good communication. Here's the impact it's going to have on us, and here's the resources we're going to put towards it. Just so they know. To me, that's kind of 101 of managing client expectations. And really what that boils down to is communication lines, right? So being able to have a transparent relationship with your client in the first place. And every client's different. It takes time. Obviously, you have to understand that person, but it's everything from what method of communication do they prefer? Are they a text-only person, or are they a little bit more old school and just want to talk on the phone? All those things you've got to learn and figure out and adapt to, which ultimately helps you in the transparency part to say, listen, I've just got to be honest with you. this doesn't make sense for us, or this is going to impact us to a really great point. So I just want to make sure you're aware. But really being able to have that open line of communication, a back channel, if you will, to your client is paramount.
We got a comment coming in on the Facebook Live feed from Katrina saying that a lot of times with an RFP, they want the most product for the lowest price. And yeah, I mean, I got to agree. A lot of times that's what people are trying to do, which isn't necessarily the best thing. In my experience as on the vendor side, just trying to get the most possible stuff for their money and not factoring in other things. Now, there's always going to be clients that are like that. Always.
Yeah, I will say, just in my personal experience, yes, I have experienced that. I will say more times than not, though, having been on the client side when I'm evaluating RFPs or listening to pitches, it really doesn't, more times than not, it does not come down to that. There is an X factor. You may go into those pitch meetings with that mindset, but once you're sitting in a room and you've heard 4 or 5 different pitches from different agencies, there's an X factor that tends to kick in. To me, when we were back evaluating, well, who makes sense for us, who wowed us, it's not always who had the best creativity. There's so many different factors. It's kind of what is the sum of those parts. And sometimes it is cost, but I think thankfully it is not always necessarily about trying to get the most for the least, at least when it comes to the actual decision.
Yeah, I think for some people, there's definitely clients I can think of in the past that it was all about the money and all about chiseling away and getting the most possible stuff for the. But to your point about the RFP maybe being broken, it's certainly not the way that I want to work. Just get a piece of paper. This is what we want. How much does it cost? For me, when I work with my clients, I definitely want to sit down with them, be told the sun and moon and the stars. I want to know what's your pie in the sky, no budget vision, then find out what your budget is, and then try and see how many of those pie in the sky things we can actually do within that budget, which to me is a much more, actually value adding way of doing it, that you're able to, possibly give them more than they thought they were going to get. That if you just actually say, this is the stuff that we want, what's your cheapest price?
Right. And Brant, in your experience, how have you vetted that information? Maybe let's say it wasn't initially in the RFP and it wasn't forthcoming. You had to go and pursue that additional information. What methods have you gone about that you found were successful?
Honestly, I really just need to jump on the phone. I'm like, this is, I just don't fill it out and hand it back. I'm like, hey, this looks great. Thanks for sending the opportunity. Let's hop on a call. Love to find out more. And most people are pretty receptive to that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm surprised the amount of times where we've gotten an RFP through the door and we have a couple follow-up questions. And again, there's a hesitancy to go back to the client and say, listen, we just need further clarification on these 3 points. We want to make sure that we're responding with a proposal that makes sense to what you're looking for. And I'm shocked how many times that does not happen, just seeking further clarification. And in that same breath, you can talk about types of technology, which ultimately lead to budgets and what's going to be feasible. And just help further vet what's the most important to them. Is it the lighting, the look and feel of an event, or is it the data capture? All of those things which greatly affect your response.
Well, and you're hitting on, so Sue is in the chat, and Sue's a regular joining us there, and she brings up that it's very difficult finding out what that X factor is. And I think you're exactly right. For some people, it's going to be data collection. For some people, it's going to be the wow factor. For other people, and that's why you kind of need to have that call. And I'm actually surprised when I'm on the client side, and I'm the one sending out the RFPs to audiovisual companies, how often they aren't, just calling me. They're just, filling out a form and sending me a pick list and going, here you go.
And Brant, how much does that then factor into your decision?
Some. I mean, responsiveness is probably more important to me personally. That if I then hop on an email and say, here's 6, okay, thank you for returning that. Here's my 6 questions. and that gets turned around relatively quickly, that's more and then when we make changes, that's because there's inevitably changes,
Right.
how quickly does that get turned around? So it plays, absolutely. But because it's not the norm, I can't say it factors, tremendously, but it's certainly nice when people do it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those, I have known people this is the Brown, Eminem, Van Halen theory, where you put something in there to see if someone's paying attention. So I have known of people who've purposely put out a somewhat vague RFP to put that in as a safety, essentially, to see if that will trigger a response for further information. And that's how they wanted to evaluate, or one aspect of how they wanted to evaluate a company's response.
So I want to kind of continue with the RFP discussion a little bit, just because so much of our world, unfortunately, kind of revolves around RFPs. And I want to give just one example that kind of came my way, where we can start to how we can start to push back a little bit. And how do you say no? How do you kind of, again, it's setting those expectations. So I had a corporate client that approached me. They were struggling on how to write their RFP. And once we hopped on the phone call, I was pretty quick to find out why. It's because it was 2 years out. They didn't have a site, and they had no idea what the theme was going to be.
Right.
And yet they wanted to write an audiovisual RFP for, for a, multi-100 person conference that was going to be like a bunch of conferences back to back. I mean, it was this whole big thing where they didn't know anything. And their biggest concern was, am I going to get taken? That we're going to put out this process, and then we're going to, agree to use audiovisual company X. But then when we figure out what the site is, and we figure out what the theme is, and we figure out exactly what we're going to do, they're going to want to charge us a bunch more money.
Right.
And I just said, well, guys, what you got to understand is, they're worried that they're going to get taken if they fill out this really vague RFP, and then all of a sudden you come back and say, we need this, we need this, we need this, and we need this. They're worried that then they're going to have to give up all of that equipment and labor for free. So we have to write this thing in a way that's going to give everybody an out. And it was almost like that hadn't occurred to them, that the AV companies would be possibly worried that they would be taken.
Listen, at the end of the day, it's about fairness, right? Whether you're the client or whether you're the vendor, you need to be able to respond to something with an educated guess, at least knowing, certain factors and variables that are going to greatly impact your response. So again, that's one of those factors, one of those X factors, going back to the client and saying, listen, we want this piece of business. We're here to be fair. We're going to give you a fair quote, but to get there, we at least need to know the venue and some of these other specs about the event. What are your goals? You're just too early and just too ahead of the curve. But let's stay in communication, and when you can feed us this intel, obviously we'd love to do business with you. And listen, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. I mean, my approach is the end of the day, we're all here to make money, and it's all about treating everybody else with respect, and we're not trying to scam you. And that all comes from, trust and relationships, which take time.
How do you feel about the business phrase, the customer is always right?
I think in a textbook theory, yeah, that made sense. Certainly in this day and age where consumers can weigh in on something, on anything at a whim, it's obviously not the case. So you have to learn what is the ask, or what is the feedback, how to process, how to evaluate that, and have a response. Not everything warrants a response. Not everything is true or factual. It's an opinion. It's not necessarily a fact. So you have those components at your disposal to respond to that. You go into an event with mechanics to respond to those type of things, and having a plan together. But no, the customer's not always right.
Well, and I want to come back to that and just say, so we can talk a little bit about some of the strategies of using, okay, how do we say no? How do we turn that around a little bit and help guide them in the directions, that we think they should go in. But before we do, before we go into that, I want to see if there was anything else that you wanted to add, kind of regarding, I totally lost my train of thought. Oh man, I hate it. All right, so never mind. Let's go back into that. Okay. Let's talk about the client strategy. So let's go where I thought we were going to go, and talk about those strategies. How do you say no? How do you help guide a customer that is either has unrealistic expectations or is asking something that's going to put you out as a business in a tremendously large way?
Yeah, I think for me, my kind of number one rule is when I'm going back to a client, and I'm looking to change something, I have to have a solution in my pocket. I can't just go to them and say, this isn't going to work. It's not going to work because of X, Y, and Z. And here's how I think it can work better. And I will wait until I have that vetted, or at least have a sense of what I think could be a viable alternative. And so many times I think people are just so reactionary, like, oh my God, this isn't going to work. And sorry, we've got to say no, but it should be a no and kind of scenario. Another little trick that I use, it's not necessarily about saying no, but if I'm trying to lead a client in a different direction or evolve their thinking about a particular topic, trend, what have you, is assertively writing a white paper or a POV from my perspective to say, here's a trend that's happening, and here's how I think we can stay competitive. Here's how I think our brand can still compete in this space or actually get ahead of the curve. There's a couple specific instances. I remember being on the agency side managing a client who was very dialed into what was happening in the music space where we were competing. And they felt that a couple other competing brands had really made some pretty extraordinary deals that kind of usurped what we were doing. So as soon as I got wind of this, before I even heard from the client, because I knew the client, I knew that was going to be their reaction, I had already started to draft white papers, basically giving our POV on what the deal was, why they did that deal, but more importantly, how I think we can actually compete in that space, evolve, and list out all those things. And doesn't always work, but I think it's a great way to try and get ahead of the curve with them, evolve the thinking, and the client ends up really appreciating that kind of approach.
So I want to take a moment just to remind everybody, feel free to answer your questions into the Zoom webinar chat or the Q&A box. Either one works great. So feel free to chime in. I feel like a lot of experienced planners are probably nodding their heads going, well, duh. But, I think, we've got a lot of different experience levels of folks that watch this show. And a lot of this stuff, this kind of tact, for lack of a better word, comes with experience, that you learn how to do the yes and. The things that I kind of wind up doing are frequently, rather than immediately committing, unless you're sure you can do it and you're sure you can do it easily, I don't immediately say yes. I'll say, let me check into that, just to give yourself a little bit of space. And then you can find out. And then, like you said, if you need to come back with well, we can do that, but it's going to cost umpteen $1 million, or we can do that and it's going to, really strain us in this other area. But so you're not just coming with the negative, but then coming up with an alternative solution that's going to get, as close as possible to what they want. And I think that's something that comes a lot of times with experience, really working, not immediately saying yes, and then coming with that yes and mentality. And we've seen a lot of articles recently about, how improv can improve us as event planners, and, really using that yes and mentality. I remembered what I wanted to just make sure that we got all of that you wanted to cover on, and that was that before we left the RFP process, I just wanted to find out if there was anything else you wanted to add about evaluating the RFP from the vendor side to make sure that it makes sense. Do we even want to answer this RFP? Like you said, it's Friday before a holiday weekend, how do you have tips for someone who is trying to decide whether or not this is a good good business, basically is what it boils down to.
I mean, I think that comes from defined values and having a mission for what that agency is trying to do, where its expertise lies. So maybe less so with the larger agencies, but a smaller agency who's obviously trying to build its portfolio is probably going to be a little more aggressive about going after more opportunities. And the mistake I've seen made is an agency has no business bidding on a piece of business. It's purely it's outside of the scope of what they're good at. And I think, if you have a defined, written, or codified set of values, and this applies to RFPs as well, and you measure against, 5, 6 different elements to say, let's put it through the filter. Does this make sense for us as an agency? And if it doesn't hit, 4 out of 6 or 5 out of 6 or whatever the number is, you have to be honest and you have to be bold and say, it doesn't make sense for us. We're going to have to politely decline, love to stay in contact with you down the road and for another piece of business. But I really think it comes from having a very defined, agreed upon set of filters that you can evaluate that against. Otherwise, every time it's changing. So codified values.
Well, and one of the things, guest of the show and I would consider a mentor, Adrian Seeger, has said many times is that you should price things so that you're happy either way, with the caveats that we had before, that it's not always about price and, all that kind of stuff. But, to a certain extent, you can use that as a value, capital V's, your values, equalizer, so that,
right.
You price something, if something isn't going to work with how you, feel it should, for lack of a better phrase, that you're able to price that in such a way that, yeah, you can get it done. Or, you can price something lower because it's, it's business that you want, or it's going to provide some kind of exposure or something along those lines, but being honest with yourself as much as you are with the clients.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning. Is there's not enough transparency both internally within an agency among themselves, and then responding back to the client themselves. So I'll throw it back to you, Brant. When you've been in those instances, when was the last time you said no, if you have, and why did you say no? How did you get to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, I've tried to price it so that I didn't have to say no, using that very same, thing. And there's just been times when someone has come back and then they're the one saying no to me, because I've said, okay, if we're going to make that go, it's going to have to be here. And then someone was willing to come in lower and make it happen. For me, honestly, it's more about schedule. It's something about, if I'm, and this is another topic that we've talked about on this show a lot is work-life balance, right? So as an independent contractor, that's something that I have to keep an eye on is, am I going to have back-to-back weeks out of town, and then if that's the case, then I probably shouldn't take the, low rent business that's wanting to be the fourth, week out of town. So that would be another case where I should price it higher. But I have had to say no because I've got a conflict. That's probably the most recent thing that's come to mind is I've already got another gig booked. But straight up no, it's back a ways, but I did have to distance myself from a client who, and this was before any of the Facebook shenanigans that we've recently had, but friended on Facebook, and the level of political toxicity that was there made me uncomfortable. And this was 6 years ago. So it's not even, not even any of the recent stuff that we've been dealing with.
Right.
But the toxic level of what was being said on Facebook by this client, I just had to say, you know what, I don't think we're a good fit. I didn't say specifically why, but just, there were other reasons that I found for it not to be a good fit.
Right. One little thing that is, so let's say that we've won the piece of business. We've gone through the RFP process. We're now to the next stage.
You read my mind, Jeff. That's exactly. Sorry. We got to get past the, all right, we got the business.
And again, this is going to sound like 101 stuff, but again, I'm bringing it up because I'm shocked how many times I've personally seen this happen or experienced this. But not having an agreed upon set of metrics for a particular event or program to define success. So the ROI. Somehow, I again, shocked how many times where you go in, you think you have an understanding with the client of how they're going to be measured against an event being successful, whether you've done your job ultimately. And you get to the end, you compile the post-mortem reports, and you put all those wonderful metrics in there, and it doesn't jive with what the client expectations are. Now, sometimes you do have an agreement with the client, but they're then sharing that with higher ups, and obviously there's miscommunication between that person and other entities. Not much you can do about that. But I just want to be clear that I've sat down with the client. Is it about brand awareness? Is it more about social media amplification? Is it more about impressions? Is it more about digital body movement through the entire campaign from start to finish? In experiential marketing, we have this age-old debate about proving our worth, proving our ROI, and we're always having to kind of fight this battle. So having a really buttoned up set of defined metrics and values at the end that everybody agrees upon is critical.
Well, I mean, and that's exactly what we're talking about, right? Is setting those expectations and then having something to measure it against. I mean, so even, not to take it back to the RFP process, but that's what that phone call is about. That initial phone call of, hey, great, got this RFP. I want to find out more about what's behind it. What are you trying to get? Because if you just had X number of people for a sales meeting, that doesn't mean anything. So knowing what are you trying to get out of this thing is going to help you guide all of the other sides of the event. And, whether it's bringing you guys in to create an experience, that experience is going to be incredibly different depending on what those goals are. Can you expand a little bit about the different types of experiences and the different types of goals that the different types of clients are going to have, and how you kind of speak to those in those initial conversations?
Yeah, I there's a stat that jumps out to me. I think it's somewhere between 10 or 11% of events are actually evaluated on data. Which is a mind-blowing stat. But of those that are actually using data to kind of prove the ROI, it's something like 40 to 50% see an increase in their event marketing budget the following year, which is a huge number. The fact that we're not all doing this, and again, it's one-on-one stuff. It's like, okay, you have to value success. I'm shocked. But the numbers there that bear out that, event marketing experiential, we're in a growth phase. And if we can just prove that worth on paper with empirical data, it's going to continue to grow.
I wanted to ask you if, and this is somewhat tangential to our conversation. I think I've used that word about 8 times today. It might've been it's a good word, tangential. Yes. We've talked on this show and around in the industry about how marketing companies and advertising companies are definitely having more and more impact on the events world. Things that were traditionally handled by production companies are now being handled by advertising and marketing companies. What I'm curious to know, and maybe you've got some insight on this, is those industries in the past had to do a lot more initial work to get the business, whether it was mock-ups or, designs or things like that. In my opinion, or in my observation, much more than the event world has had to do. Is there any chance that because those agencies are more used to that, they're getting more and more of this business because of that? We're going to work with you. We're going to mock it up. We're going to give you an idea of what you've got even before we sign on the dotted line.
Yeah, you obviously see the contrition and acquisitions that are happening in the space, and everybody's rolling up these different capabilities under one roof, and I completely get it. where it becomes harder and harder for the medium to small size companies or agencies to compete against that is these larger agencies can spend resources against that. So they're doing these huge color mock-ups and drawings and renderings that maybe a smaller agency just can't afford to do. Again, putting all those resources towards. So I certainly understand it from a business perspective. These medium to smaller size agencies got to be scrappy. They've got to be nimble, and they're having to compete against larger agencies that just have more resources at their disposal. But again, that's where that X factor comes in, that there's sometimes that undefinable quality about a particular group or team, agency, that just differentiates them against maybe, the 800-pound gorilla in the room that's used to winning most of the business. So yeah, it's figuring out what your differentiator is and being able to be scrappy and nimble and set yourself apart.
Kind of along those same lines, the last episode we talked a lot. We talked about e-gaming and esports, and a lot of the episodes surrounded and revolved around what kind of more traditional events can learn from esports, and what esports could learn from more traditional events, and that there was a lot of these groups need to be talking to each other a lot more than they already are. I'm curious to know, in your mind, if are there lessons to be learned kind of from the B2B B2C side that more traditional conferences and trade shows and meetings and the like, are there things that these two realms can learn from each other?
Yeah. So for me, I live in Silicon Valley and moved here about 6 years ago. And most of my background has been consumer-facing experiential campaigns. When I got here and I saw the lay of the land, and obviously from a tech perspective, there's a lot more B2B events that are happening here in this market. So for me, the obvious thing was, well, I don't have a ton of experience in that space, but it's got to be transferable skills. I need to try and network my way in. And as I did, and I would have these conversations, I was really surprised how much resistance there was, that, nope, you've either done B2B your whole life, you're a trade show guy, and that's what we're looking for, or, hey, you're consumer facing, it's apples and oranges. And I would say to these guys, listen, you should be desperately trying to get folks like myself with kind of a more consumer-facing approach and lens to come into the B2B space. And I was always taken aback, like how most folks just didn't see it that way. So to answer your question, it's not about B2B. It's not about B2C. To me, as trite as this sounds, it's about B to I. It's about individuals. Whether it's a trade show, it's a meeting, it's a team dinner, or it's a crazy stunt or this big experiential campaign, you should always be approaching it of, these are individuals, they are customers or consumers, no matter what the landscape that we're communicating with them in is. Yes, there are slightly different tools. Yes, there are slightly different approaches and goals of B2B versus B2C. But I think for the most part, it's taking a consumer mentality and applying that. And I've seen folks like Dreamforce does a great job of doing this. I think Google I/O is another example. But I'm still shocked at how many times the B2B space is just this dry experience. And I think there's just a ton of opportunity there for evolution, if you will.
Well, and you still see so many, it's hard when you go to our industry events and you see these fun booths and people are having happy hours and that kind of stuff. But, when you go to a lot of other trade shows for a lot of other industries, it's still so much of, here's a free squishy ball and, and you want to drop your business card in a fishbowl. And there's, so little, actual interaction going on and, set pieces and fun. It's, just the boring old corporate sets. And I love what you say about the, the B to I, we were kind of chatting before the show a little bit that, One of the things that's always bothered me is when we talk about experiences and providing a good experience for the attendees, that shouldn't be different if we're talking about a paid attendee at a conference or someone who's in a meeting, a sales meeting that they have to go to because they're going to reveal the numbers and they have to have them every quarter. The outcomes are going to be different. The goals are going to be different. What you want to measure as your ROI is going to be different. But ultimately, don't you want people to enjoy the experience and want to come back the next year?
Yeah, and listen, it can be something as simple as just taking an event out of its normal space. Right now the big trend is to do non-traditional spaces, non-traditional venues. And it can be a relatively inexpensive way to take a smaller project or a smaller event and really escalate it. Not that this is small, but Google I/O, has gone out of the convention center hall and actually gone outdoors to Shoreline Amphitheater and turned it into a festival.
Yep.
That's such a smart approach.
Look, that's a great. I just want to pause you right there because think about that week. So that week we had Google I/O and Microsoft Build overlapping to a certain extent, if I remember right, and Google I/O, when they first went outside, people were complaining and it was hot and I'm in the sun. But by this year, anybody that I heard that was a tech reporter that went to that, they were like, oh, it was so nice. And the birds were tweeting and it was outside. And then on the other side, Microsoft had a 3-hour opening keynote where they had to have an exercise break in the middle. Oh, I mean, just comparing those two as apples and oranges.
Yeah, but again, it doesn't have to be expensive. You can take a small thing, you can take it outdoors. And the great thing about going non-traditional is a lot of times you're entering spaces where they don't really know how to price something. You don't have preferred vendors that you're stepping in with. You don't have an F&B package that you're having to pay crazy margins for. You can kind of make it up as you go. So obviously it is a trend and I see it continuing because it's smart and it makes all the sense in the world. And it's just it can be a much better experience.
Now Hans in the chat suggests H2H, human to human. So I like that a lot.
Whatever acronym or terminology you want to use. Yeah.
Yeah. So to bring it back to client expectations, I think it's important to say then if we're going down these roads and we're trying new things like going out to a non-traditional space or something along those lines, I think that's another time when event planners and production companies, things like that, often forget to set expectations. Maybe we'll come up with a rain, plan, at best, but then thinking about even, okay, what if it's just windy, or what are we going to do if it's not really rainy, but it's just kind of drizzly and cold and nobody wants to be there, and being honest about that. Nobody ever seems to want to bring up the negative possible outcomes on things because we want to be gung-ho and it's going to be the best event ever, but that's really important sometimes.
And listen, taking that one step further beyond just, weather-related items, but, safety. Obviously, yes. This is a huge concern these days. So having a defined emergency crisis plan in place that you have to loop the client into. That client has to understand exactly, for different scenarios, what our protocol is and know that we're thinking about that and making sure that they're aware and in the loop. And again, it sounds like 101, but I do not see that happening on every event I'm working on, even on very large events where it should be a no-brainer.
And it's unfortunate we get locked into somewhat being reactionary that, you think about, the events in Las Vegas, all of a sudden there was a lot of people looking to the festival organizers, looking to the hotels saying, how do we make sure this never happens again? And that's it's a great question to ask, but unfortunately you can never plan for every possible scenario. And so to even pretend that something like that can never happen again is kind of lying to yourself. And so you need to set expectations there too, that we will do everything in our power to make this event as safe as possible. And we will have a plan for if something goes horribly wrong. But beyond that, you can't promise it's never going to happen.
Well, yeah, you need to have a a basic foundation of a plan. So obviously you're not going to know every iteration of something that happens, but there's kind of 4 or 5 buckets you can essentially sign off on that, you can then apply. But as long as there is an understanding of something catastrophic's happening, something that's impacting us, here's the 5 steps that we're going to take. Here's who assigned with those responsibilities, so everybody is aware. I will say, just because you mentioned Vegas, I happened to be in Vegas a block away from the shooting the night it happened. We were loading in the next morning for a trade show at MGM. And we were in the lobby and commotion starts happening. Obviously, we didn't understand at first what was going on. Once we learned of what the situation was. Obviously, we did not have a plan together yet, but a couple of the folks on the production team, our executive producer, said, okay, that's it. We're getting everybody together. We're going to go upstairs. We're all going to do a head count in one room and then try to reach out to the client. And then over the course of the next couple of hours, as the magnitude of what was happening was realized, and we were loading in at 7 a.m. the next morning, we had to then ask ourselves, are we going to have a show? Like, are people going to travel to Vegas? Can we set the right tone for having this trade show? And we didn't know. We were making up as we went because we didn't really have that in place for what had happened. So can't plan for everything, but at least you start the conversation.
Exactly. I mean, and just to take it out of the life and death realm and more into the fun stuff, the technology side is another side that I frequently wish people would do a better job of setting expectations, that, and is another instance where people are afraid to say no. That there's no such thing as Wi-Fi that works 100% of the time. There's no such thing as any technology product that works 100% of the time. And I think we as event technology people need to be more honest about that and have backup plans and say, all right, if this doesn't work, here's what we're going to do. And you never want to talk about your product not working. I get that. Okay.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, you have to have those backup plans in place. What happens if the PowerPoint goes down? What happens if, as what happened at Connect, I think 2 years ago, the Connect conference, somebody drives their car into a power transformer and knocks out, a quarter of the grid, and takes down all the power. So in the middle of somebody's keynote. So, having some idea of what happens in these scenarios and some idea, and I was working on an event where we were doing audience response technology, and it was a 2-day event. And the first day it wasn't working very well. And we stayed up basically all night, in the room. The hotel swapped out the Wi-Fi, routers. I mean, it would work fine if one person was doing it, but as soon as 300 people were doing it, it would slam down. And it was not, as far as we could tell, the system's fault. It was something to do with the Wi-Fi and the interconnectivity. And at the end of the night, they wanted me to promise them that it was going to work perfectly the next day. And I looked them in the eye and I said, I just can't do that. I want to be able to do that. I wish I could do that. We've done everything in our power to make sure it's going to work perfectly tomorrow, but I can't promise you that it is.
And was that a case, Brant, where you had an inkling that, given kind of the bandwidth load you would be putting on once the room was full, that you'd manage that expectation in advance with the client, either the walkthrough the day before, or did you guys have some sense and try and alert them in advance, or was it a situation where they just came in and it just didn't perform?
Came in and just didn't. Yeah. So the system should, if they were getting the numbers that we were supposed to be getting and everything was showing that we were getting the bandwidth that we were supposed to be getting, it should have worked flawlessly. And that's why literally the hotel was going out and replacing the routers, because it should have worked flawlessly.
Right.
And this was a very low bandwidth application, so it's not like it was pictures or video or anything crazy like that. But for whatever reason, as soon as 200 people started banging on it at the same time, the whole system would shut down. And, we troubleshot it as best we could late into the night. And I've had several of those moments over the course of my career where I just, I could not bring myself to say, I can promise this. And I think we have to be honest sometimes. I've known some people in my career that would never do that. They would just say, yep, it'll be fine. And then they'd rather be wrong about that than to say that at the time, because they don't, and I understand, they don't want the person to be nervous. They don't want them to worry.
Yeah.
So they see it as a white lie to, make them feel, not nervous about it. But
yeah. Well, one thing related to that, staying with technology, kind of going back to the beginning part of the funnel, if you will, is when that RFP comes in the door, and how you manage clients who are just reacting to the new shiny object. So whatever the latest technology, gizmo, toy, whatever it is, and they're jumping on board saying, oh my gosh, we need to have a program or an event that incorporates the new shiny object. And you evaluate that and you're like, well, what are your goals? And for whatever reason, it doesn't match up. The client's pushing like, no, we got to show that we're relevant and we're following trends. And, for me, I go back and I try and say, this doesn't match up to your strategy and goals. I try and give them an alternative, or I try and present a different type of event that may incorporate that. But this notion where clients are reaction or can be reactionary to the new shiny object, the new trend, and having them understand that there's a much greater negative impact of you going into a space and not being able to do it correctly, organically, authentically, whatever buzzwords you want to use, that there's a much greater downside to that than trying to force fit something into a program that just simply doesn't work.
Well, and once again, you're reading my mind, because that's where I kind of wanted to start to close things out as we wrap it up here, is that especially when you're trying to be leading edge, you experiment with things and you try things, and you have to be willing to accept the fact that a certain percentage of those could fail. And so, if you're going to try, or what I would recommend is that you try kind of one new thing each time, So as you're trying to do new things in your event, maybe just try one new thing as opposed to 6 new things, because if for some reason all 6 of those new things go south, then you're really going to be in trouble. But if you're only pushing the envelope in one area at a time, then you can be, manage it, and then this, and maybe this is a topic for another day, being honest and managing the expectations of your attendees, and that point, and saying, hey, we're trying this new thing. And then if it fails, you're able to say, well, we tried, as opposed to we're rolling out this new technology that's going to be amazing. And then it fails. And then, oops.
Listen, I think that's a great point. I think getting consumer buy-in on this, and listen, if you set the right tone with this, and depending on the event, I think you absolutely should be experimenting, trying those things. And if you position it correctly with the audience, with the right tone, the right setup, they'll buy in, they'll experiment, they'll try something. Again, you'd be amazed how many times you can actually try something or get away with something or experiment if you positioned it correctly, whether it's the client or whether it's the consumer.
Exactly. Well, it is starting to be towards the end. We started a couple minutes late, and we don't have the outro to go through this time, so we can probably roll a little bit late. But we want to make sure that we get your one tip. So the one tip that you've got for event planners.
I think for me, and this is maybe for someone who's a little more junior starting out, but when you're on site at an event as an event producer, you're going to be pulled in a million different directions. Everybody's going to come to you with their issue, their problem, and to them, it's the priority. And not everything is weighted the same. The reality is some things are a bigger priority than others, but you will feel like everything is on fire, essentially, from those folks. So for me, it's how do you evaluate and then prioritize and put out those fires? So it's a combination of what you can handle yourself versus what you're going to delegate. And it's a little bit old school, but I have a sheet of paper divided into 4 quadrants that I use that is on my person for every show day. So it's my punch list, it's what's on fire, it's contacts, and it's call outs for things that you need to remember for the postmortem. It's simple, but for me, the simple act of writing something down and then seeing all 4 quadrants on paper at once helps me define what's a priority, helps me understand this can wait, this has got to be fixed right now. So for me, that's my method to my madness. But yeah, and a lot of times this just comes through experience. You know, when you're starting out, you want to please everybody and you maybe don't have the experience to understand a problem with the fire marshal versus a problem with the ice machine is broken. Well, which one is a bigger priority? So that it just comes through repetition, comes through experience, but evaluation and prioritizing the right things that need to be solved.
Always good advice. And like you say, a lot of times it feels like 101 stuff, but we wouldn't be bringing it up if it wasn't frequently forgotten or overlooked or those kinds of things. And any other tool, cool resources or anything that's helping you out? Doesn't have to be related to this. It could be a website or a blog or a book.
Yeah, 2 quick things. One is something most people have in their pocket, which is a phone, in this case, an iPhone. Sorry to my Android users, but in the phone is in the Compass app, which comes with every single iPhone. If you swipe on it, there's actually a level that's built into your iPhone. So as an event producer, when I'm scouting a venue, you're constantly having to measure space, get the specs, but you're also measuring for the levelness of the floor, different spaces, and most people don't carry an actual level. So it's actually built right into your phone. I use it all the time. And then secondly, actually wrapping up today here in the San Francisco Bay Area is the Event Marketer Summit, EMS. And they have just released, as of I think yesterday or the day before, the winners for the last year for the best experiential programs across, I think it's 24 different categories. So if you're new to experiential or you just kind of want to see what's happening in the space of experiential, go look at that list. Look at the agencies that are doing them. Look at the actual work itself. And it'll give you a nice insight and perspective into the trends that are happening in experiential and kind of the cream of the crop. So, yeah.
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I'm glad we got to finally have this conversation and get some of it off our chest. A little cathartic, get a little bit of it out, but hopefully we help some people along the way. And it looks like from some of the comments in the chat that some folks got some good points out of this and appreciated the conversation. Where can folks find out more about you and what you're up to?
Yeah, the easiest way is you can find me on Twitter at JeffDV8, on Instagram at JeffDV8. Feel free to email me at jeffdv8@gmail.com. And happy to respond and connect and network.
Dan, you're already changing lives because Diane didn't know about the level, so she's pretty happy to find out about that in the chat. So right there on. You go. That's why we do this, right? It's those little tidbits every day.
It's the little things.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming. I want to remind everybody that EventIcons is recorded live every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern. You can watch behind the scenes on Facebook Live. But the way that we would love for you to join us is by going to event-icons.com. There you can see the show notes, all the links to the resources that are shared. You can sign up there, and then you can be a part of the Zoom chat. And then you've got basically a direct link to our brains. You can visit us in the chat room. You can ask us questions in the Q&A. And we can see all of that live as we record. Love it when you guys join us live because it's all about the questions that you have. I can blather on for hours. Will can blather on for hours. We can all blather on for hours. But we want to know what you want to hear about. Let us know who are the icons that you want to hear about. What are the topics that you want to hear about? Use hashtag EventIcons on Twitter. Let us know there what you thought of the show. Let us know there what your tips are for managing clients and what your best stories are when you've had to say no. and when you've had to turn away business. When was the last time you had to turn away business? Let us know that as well. Don't forget, then we released the show about a week or so afterward on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever your favorite podcast app, so you can have us beamed directly into your head every week. So we want to thank Allison, Ben, Diane, Jamal, Sue, Juan, Hans, and Geraldine for joining us live during the show today. I think we also saw Katrina over on Facebook. I had to bring it up. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Event Icons.
Thank you for joining us for another amazing episode of #EventIcons. To catch the transcription and all of the resources mentioned, head to www.helloendless.com/blog. This week's episode will be posted and available by next Tuesday. Also, let us know what you thought about this week's episode. Share your biggest takeaway and join the social conversation. Sponsored by Little Bird Told Media. Just tag your post with #EventIcons. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you next Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on #EventIcons.